I'm going to read to you a passage from a letter. And if you've never heard this passage before or read it, then I bet you won't be able to guess who wrote it. Here's the passage. On the coming of evening, I return to my house and enter my study. And at the door, I take off the day's clothing covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly, and reclothed appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine, and which I was born for, where I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions, and they in their kindness answer me. And for 4 hours of time I do not feel boredom, I forget every trouble, I do not dread poverty, I am not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them. That could almost be a manifesto for this show, man. I'm telling you, that is like the young Heretics motto or mantra. That little image of putting on your regal clothes and going to the courts of ancient men and feeling no boredom or fear, right? That's us. That's what this show is about. Who wrote it? I'm going to give you some hints. The author is living in exile, in sort of rural agrarian exile. And he says that he's surrounded by country people who can't really, this food is his alone, meaning at least in part that, he doesn't really have anyone to talk about it with. And he's feeling as if the literary nourishment is only for him. And he feeds on it, that ancient texts are like food. So who is this? Is this Petrarch? Is it Cicero? Is it Yeats? It is not any of those people. It is Niccolo Machiavelli. And the reason that I started with this passage, and the reason that I made you guess who it was if you hadn't read it before, is because Machiavelli is a really hard guy to talk about unless you get all of your previous conceptions about him out of your head, right? This is from a letter from Machiavelli to his friend Francesco Vittori, who was an ambassador in Rome, and he wrote it in 1513 around Christmas. And it's kind of daunting to come to Machiavelli or, to Shakespeare or to any of these people because there has been so much said about him and so many people have read him and talked about him and said brilliant things and gained brilliant things from them, that you kind of have to clear away all of the other preconceptions before you can even access him. And that feels like kind of ambitious or even arrogant to be like, well, I now am going to have a direct contact with Machiavelli, with the great Machiavelli. And I'm not going to think about, the adjective Machiavellian, right? And all the things that have been said about him, that he's conniving and ruthless and nihilistic and cynical. And, maybe we get there. Maybe we will talk about why people think about him that way. But to kind of say, nope, it's going to be me and Machiavelli. And to not sort of start with everybody else's preconception. Very hard thing to do. And the reason that I started with this letter is it gives you this totally different picture of the guy, right? Just this erudite, sensitive, soulful humanist. And that's part of him too. And so, this is kind of, when I say the word if I started by saying the word Machiavelli, you would immediately think that you know this person. You don't know him yet. And this is, this show is an argument for, this whole show is an argument for engaging as Machiavelli did, face to face with the people themselves and the writing that they left behind, and then hearing what other people have to say about them. Now, I should make one caveat to that, which is, of course, part of the premise of this show and of all good critical editions is also that sometimes you need a little introduction. You need to know kind of when the person lived and all that stuff, and what he was writing about. But with somebody who has been so, I think, misunderstood and certainly so recycled by popular culture, not by great, there have been great scholars of Machiavelli who have nuanced approaches to him, but popular culture has basically appropriated him as just this sly, ruthless realist. And there is a moral for us in all of this, I think, which is that being a realist about the hard truths of the world, which I think is what Machiavelli was, can earn you a reputation for heartlessness, even if you are not heartless. And this is something that we're seeing now today all the time. I mean, there's stuff that you have to say right now that just makes people's hair catch on fire because it just sounds so unnice, right? Like that BLM is a movement that isn't for Black people, that doesn't help black people. It's just an elite Marxist movement. Or that, that people in the world are going to die of illness, and that the attempts to make nobody ever die of coronavirus are foolhardy, right? These sorts of things that you say that and people are like, oh my gosh, as if you want that to happen, as if you want it to be the case that people die of illness, right? As if you want the bad things in the world to be true. But what you really are just saying is a truth, that the world is broken and that there are tragedies in it. And Machiavelli, in some ways, for the modern world, inaugurates that hard-nosed, just clear-eyed look at the pain and the suffering of the world, and asks seriously what to do about it. But that does not, in fact, make him evil. It doesn't make him amoral or even just purposefully immoral. Here's the next passage of that letter that I read at the beginning. He says, and because Dante says, it does not produce knowledge when we hear but do not remember, I have noted everything in their conversation, that is his conversation with the ancients that he's reading, in their conversation which has profited me, and have composed a little work on principalities, where I go as deeply as I can into considerations on this subject, debating what a princedom is, of what kinds they are, how they are gained, how they are kept, why they are lost. And if ever you can find any of my fantasies pleasing, this one should not displease you. And by a prince, and especially by a new prince, it ought to be welcomed. Hence, I am dedicating it to his magnificence, Giuliano. We're going to talk about who Giuliano is in a bit. Filippo Casavecchia has seen it. He can give you some account in part of the thing itself and of the discussions I have had with him, though I am still enlarging and revising it. What is this work? It's The Prince. It is the famous, the monumental work that everybody now reads of Machiavelli. And in fact, all of his major works are written during this period of exile when he was kicked out of Florence for reasons that I will shortly describe. So he writes in this time, he writes The Prince, and at the same time, he's working on his Discourses on Livy, which is actually a much longer work, and in some ways, I think a fuller picture of his political ideas and of his attitudes. And then, of course, also The Art of War is the kind of third great Machiavellian work. But note the reference to Dante, right? And he's reading Petrarch. In some ways, he stands in the tradition that we talked about when we talked about Petrarch and Dante, of kind of reinvigorating this classicism in the Christian world. So the world has changed drastically since antiquity. But for Petrarch and for Dante, there is this urge also to revitalize and reclaim what there was of truth and goodness in the ancient world. And Machiavelli is squarely a part of that. He comes later, like I said, 1513, he writes that letter. But he is their sort of an inheritor of them and of their fascination with the ancient world. And so it's during this time out with the Rubes that he writes all of these great works. But why? Why was he in exile? Well, thereby hangs a very important tale about Machiavelli's remarkable life. But first, before I start telling you all about that, let me briefly say welcome and thank you for being here. Anybody who's listening for the first time, super glad you're here. Love to do this show. Love to hear from you about the show. Do let me know what you think of the episodes on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. Wherever you're listening, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, on Stitcher, on Google Play, on SoundCloud, and so forth. And if you like the show, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes. That really helps us to grow the show. The show is growing in a lot of exciting ways, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. You can just let people know on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, but you can also leave a 5-star review. That really, really helps. Before we go on, here is an incredibly exciting announcement. For the very, very first time on Young Heretics, we have a sponsor. This is awesome. I'm so excited to have sponsors. And I'm particularly excited about this sponsor. Obviously, you guys know how much I love doing this show. You know I would do it if I had to do it in a paper bag, screaming into a megaphone on the street corner. It's just that much fun. But the amazing thing is that other people also find it fun. And now we have sponsors. So this is just like great. It's the perfect sponsor for Young Heretics because it answers a question that a bunch of people have been asking. All the time, people say, how do I learn Greek? How do I learn Latin? How do I learn the ancient languages? And I, have various suggestions, but now I have the suggestion for you because look, I do believe that even though it's amazing to talk about ancient texts and to read them in translation, and you get tons out of that, the true bona fide experience is that face-to-face encounter that you get with somebody in his or her native language. And really, to have that intimate relationship with Plato or Aristotle or Virgil that has, followed me my whole life, and I hope will follow many of you your whole lives, that you have to read them in the original. Big proponent of this. And, some of you are going into grad school, or you have professional reasons to do this, but plenty of people are just passionate about ancient history, ancient texts. And so the Ancient Language Institute is for you. It's especially for you if you are really not a fan of the kind of long lists of grammar and vocab, these, endless verb paradigms, endless conjugations. If you are somebody that learns best in a natural way, through immersion, right, the way that we learn a lot of modern languages now, then Ancient Language Institute is perfect because it just does that for the classical languages. So any language you learn with Ancient Language Institute, you will begin reading, listening to, and speaking in your target language from day one. And this is a great way to get that kind of, natural, intuitive grasp of a language beyond just knowledge about, oh, this is how I say that, to really have that felt sense of, oh yeah, this word is better than that word here, or the reason he used this word is because this. So if this sounds like something you are interested in, and it should be, go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and you can get started today. If you enter the code heretics, like in the title, HERETICS, you will get 15% off. So that's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, offer code heretics to get 15% off. All right, back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Florentine, and this is important. He lived in Florence, which was a city-state, and it's in the northern third of Italy. It's not way up to the north, but it's in the north. And the important thing to know, the central thing to know about Florence, is that it has this proud history dating back really to the 12th century of being a republic. And we've talked a lot on this show about what a republic is, and there are different ways of looking at it. I mean, one sort of central thing to a republic is sort of self-representation by the people, that people elect representatives, even if it's, it doesn't have to be everybody who elects. It can be a land-holding people, so different republics have had different voting classes. But you have the people who elect representatives, and then you typically, it's thought, and this goes back, to Sparta and to Rome, you have these tripartite governments, which incorporate the three kind of basic ways of doing government, which are monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy. And you sort of balance your elites up against your, your sort of power broker, your leader, up against your voting people and your populace. And so Florence is part of this revitalization after sort of rebellion against feudalism and this revitalization of the Latin idea of libertas, hugely important value for Roman city-states at the time. And Florence is kind of famous for holding on to that, even as other states kind of fall under the influence of what's called signori, of the kind of, singular leaders. And so Florence is kind of the heart of a even before the Renaissance, of a revitalization of the Roman ideal of self-government and of liberty. However, by the time Machiavelli was born, this self-perception on Florence's part had really become just that. It was only a self-perception, because increasingly there were these families that sort of were coming to dominate, to exert so much power over the state that the democracy, the elections and the representation were kind of in name only. And it was the Medici, the famous Medici family, who I'm sure you've heard of before, who triumph over sort of some rivals. The Abizi are kind of some of their major rivals, and they triumph in 1434, and they start to basically just take the place over. They rule over these councils, eventually a council that is appointed for life and really in the pocket of the Medici. By the time Machiavelli is born, which is in 1469, they really are kind of in control. And the same year that he's born, in fact, a new Medici rises to power, Lorenzo de' Medici. And he takes over from his grandfather, Piero di Cosimo. And Lorenzo is famous. This Lorenzo, there are other Lorenzo Medicis, but this Lorenzo is the one who is famous for having been a huge patron of the arts. And so this is also going on, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, all these people are decorating the cities of Italy, and especially Florence, with these fabulous, enduring works of great art. And we will talk about all these people at a later time. But what's interesting is that Machiavelli, although he stands in an important relationship to those artists, doesn't really pay a ton of attention to the visual arts. But it's also, and this is something important, it's the period when Columbus will soon sail the ocean blue. 1492, the year Machiavelli turned 23. Columbus, of course, made his famous voyage to the New World, which would become America. That is also the year that Lorenzo died. And so there's a lot going on in this period, right? And remember that Columbus is financed by Ferdinand and Isabella, by Spanish monarchs. So it's not as if that's going on right in Florence or anything. But under the Medici, Florence is a center of artistic innovation and production. And then there's other really exciting kind of Renaissance stuff and exploration going on as well in other areas. So 1492, Columbus sails, Lorenzo dies, and his son takes over, Piero the Unfortunate, which is a good name because shortly after he takes over in 1494, there is an invasion by the French king, an invasion of Italy. This is Charles VIII. And this is a huge threat to the established order and is also kind of a formative moment in Machiavelli's life. Essentially, Piero caves. He makes this very submissive treaty with Charles VIII. And the result is that the Florentines exile him. And so that breaks Medici control of Florence and reverts Florence to its republican roots, which, remember, go back to the 12th century, to 1115. The new republic is sternly religious. It sees the rise to great influence of this Dominican friar, Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola is a famous name for a whole bunch of reasons. Dominicans, if you don't know, are Catholic mendicants. They're a religious order. They're devoted to traveling about, to poverty, to spreading the gospel, to simplicity. And Savonarola was particularly hostile to excess. I mean, they're Catholics, but he was hostile to the Pope. He kind of snubbed the Pope on several occasions, and he ran this campaign of just extreme purity and moral cleansing, including bonfires of the vanities, which are where you burn objects that are thought of as sources of sin, and that includes manuscripts, irreplaceable manuscripts in some cases, and much was lost in those bonfires. Very, very strict, one might even say, tyrannical regime. It didn't last long. Savonarola was hanged as a heretic, and just days afterward, Machiavelli was elevated to a position. He'd never really been in public life. He's 29. He's never been in public life. He becomes head of the Second Chancery, and that puts him in charge of foreign affairs in subject territories. So this is, it's not a like super high up position, but it's a position of influence, and he does a lot of meeting with powerful people, power brokering in Rome and elsewhere, travels around a lot. And it's a job that he seems to really excel at and to love. Machiavelli is accused wrongly of conspiring against the Medici, of trying to kind of revert to the Republic. He is tortured, imprisoned, and then finally exiled to just south of Florence, where he lives on his farm, and he does this work that he's describing of just going back. And this is a trope. I mean, not quite right. It's something that happens often, and so it becomes a trope of literary culture. Cicero is another famous example of people that are forced out of public life, forced out of political life, and then therefore kind of revert to deeper study and deeper productivity. And this is, of course, when Machiavelli writes all of his great work. And so, there's much to be gained from understanding that this is the context in which the prince occurs, if for no other reason than that he not only had seen some of the most drastic shifts of power, but he had also understood, what it was for a government to be unstable. And the prince is basically about how to keep power, how in Italian, mantenere lo stato, to keep the state of affairs. And you have to understand that when he's talking about all this dastardly stuff that princes, that as leaders can do, single leaders of a city-state or of a principality can do to keep power. Because what is the ends that justify those means? Well, it's keeping the things of the state running. It's keeping things from being just like constantly devolving into uncertainty and into bloodbaths. That's what the prince is fundamentally sort of about. And as we mentioned, it's addressed to Lorenzo di Piero di Medici, who is the Duke of Urbino, the next Medici, who rules Florence between 1516 and 1519. And he begins with a kind of address to that prince. And so what's interesting is, and we'll get to this in a second, it's not actually about the kind of prince that the Medici are, because it's about princes who seize new. Well, it's about princes who seize new power, and the Medici have had power for a long time, but they've just re-seized it. So here's how he describes in chapters 1 and 2 of The Prince. And I'm reading here from a wonderful book, The Essential Writings of Machiavelli, which is edited and translated by Peter Constantine, and it's just great. I really like it. It's got the whole of The Prince in it, and then selections from the discourses. When I read from the discourses, I'll read from a full copy of the discourses, the Penguin Classics edition. But this is a really kind of handy way to get a hold on Machiavelli's thought. So here's chapter 1, introducing his subject. He says, all states, all dominions that rule or have ruled over men are or have been either republics or principalities. Principalities are either hereditary, with long-established bloodline, or new. And the new principalities are entirely new, as Milan was to Francesco Sforza, or are like limbs added to the hereditary state of the prince who acquires them, as the kingdom of Naples was to the king of Spain. So one of the things you'll note about Machiavelli, and I'll come back to this, he's kind of like the archetype of that IR bro in your college seminar, that like knows every like minor detail about the most random battle. And so he'll like raise his hand and be like, well, actually in the Crimean War, there was an obscure Russian contingent, and this is just like, and what Machiavelli does is he focuses on these examples, on just all of these, taken from his vast reading, all of these little things that have happened. What happened in Germany? How does it work in France? He's sort of seen, of course, a lot of this in his work and in the Second Chancery. And so there's a way in which he kind of just draws on all of these very specific examples to kind of make his case. And we'll get in a second to why that's important. But here's the rest of chapter 1. States obtained in this way, that is, states obtained newly, are accustomed to either living under a prince or to being free. They are acquired either with the arms of others or with one's own, either by chance or by skill. That's the whole first chapter. So that's, right off the bat, we kind of see something, a few things that I think are really important about Machiavelli. First of all, he's kind of openly, and this has been said before, he's kind of openly job hunting in this book. And that's not the whole point of the thing. But he is trying to get back into the graces of a prince and of Lorenzo, of this, new Medici ruler. And so he says in the opening, before the preface, he says, people give the best possession that they have to offer princes as a display of loyalty and gratitude and so forth. I give you the best thing that I have, which is this unique insight into the world. And one of the things, specifically into the political world, right? I have this, after all my study, I have something that nobody else has, a way of looking at the world. And in fact, there are some things that are, even in this first chapter, remarkably innovative. So one thing is, I talked earlier about that tripartite theory of government, right? And that basically is, with some notable exceptions, that is basically the going line from antiquity. It's great wisdom from antiquity, from Aristotle and Plato, that there are three forms of government: democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, and the republics. Combine them all into one. And Machiavelli basically says in this, the world has moved past that. The world has changed. And whereas those are still the three basic forms of operation, there really aren't any pure, democracies or aristocracies to speak of that we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about the two major options that I've seen in my life in Florence. And those are that you can have a principality, a leader by one person. The King of France is a good example of this. And, the Holy Roman Empire is also at this time kind of a good contender for that. Or you can have republics, which are these kind of combinations of various of the three different forms of government. Now, the way in which Machiavelli avoids sort of adjudicating between those two is very subtle. He basically says, I've talked about republics elsewhere, and that's the discourses on Livy, his commentary on Rome's republic. But this is about princes, and it's specifically about princes who get power and how to keep it. So there's something in which Lorenzo would certainly be interested, given the sort of volatile state of the Medici's reign and rule. But he offers this totally new schematic. And it's also kind of in contrast to a theory that was sort of popular. I mean, even Dante in his work on monarchy kind of advanced this theory that because the Christian kingdom of heaven was universal, eventually what would happen is everybody would get united under one great empire. And that's, in many ways, that's part of the rhetoric of these big land-eating empires like the Holy Roman Empire. And Machiavelli kind of rejects that. He's seen Florence almost bend the knee to the French king. And he says, no, actually there's like a lot of different stuff going on in different places. And the most effective way is to respond to the circumstances precisely to what circumstances going on where. And that's why the IR bro thing is important. IR stands for international relations for people that don't know. You have these people like in college that really study, and then they often go on to work in the public sector or in major administrations. These people that kind of minutely analyze the specifics of a particular political scenario. That's one of Machiavelli's kind of very important and somewhat innovative approaches, that he doesn't want to basically theorize in the abstract about this universal idea of monarchy or of empire, but rather to sort of say, well, in each circumstance, you need a very particular approach that takes into account the real scenario on the ground. And he's super self-conscious about that as a new thing, as a kind of innovative form of political theory. And really, this is kind of the first major work of political philosophy in modernity, the Princes. And Machiavelli kind of inaugurates that whole tradition that we now have and shapes in many ways the way that we now look at politics. I'm going to read now just the introduction, the very beginning of the discourses on Livy. And because in the preface, he basically says exactly what I'm talking about by comparison, interestingly, to Columbus. And so here's the opening, right? He says, although, owing to the envy inherent in man's nature, it has always been no less dangerous to discover new ways and methods than to set off in search of new seas and unknown lands, because most men are much more ready to belittle than to praise another's actions. Nonetheless, impelled by the natural desire I have always had to labor, regardless of anything, on that which I believe to be for the common benefit of all, I have decided to enter upon a new way, as yet untrodden by anyone else, and even if it entails a tiresome and difficult task, it may yet reward me in that there are those who will look kindly on the purpose of these my labors. And if my poor ability, my limited experience of current affairs, my feeble knowledge of antiquity should render my efforts imperfect and of little worth, they may nonetheless point the way for another of greater ability, capacity for analysis, and judgment, who will achieve my ambition, which, if it does not earn me praise, should not earn me reproaches. Now we're going to talk in a little bit about what that new method is, but note it's a new world. There's new stuff going on, and the world doesn't look the way it looked in antiquity. And so even though the insights of antiquity can still be relevant, we need to apply them in the way that the modern world demands. And that's as new in political theory as it is in geography and in this exploration that Columbus is doing, to which he refers. So that is kind of a shocking claim that he really backs up, and this is also, this sort of visibly false modesty, right? About, my poor knowledge of antiquity. I mean, on some level, I sort of think when people call this sort of thing false modesty, it's only half the picture, because anybody who's tried to write a book does know that, in fact, you do feel very inadequate, and you feel that even your best efforts, even if you have a high opinion of your talents, your best efforts will always fall short. But it's also, and this is genius because he's writing about Livy, it's also a kind of callback, a throwback to the preface of Livy's history, where Livy also gestures toward, wow, this thing has gotten so big, it's such a huge task, and people might rush to the end of it to read about sort of the lead up to modern days, but I am going to content myself with these reflections on the ancient past. And so, Machiavelli is rejecting a lot of conventional wisdom here, both from antiquity and from all around him, that there's not going to be this one world government, which is something actually very relevant to our times. I mean, we have now gone to this point where, we don't do it in quite this kind of Christianizing way, but we do owe it, I think, to these sort of Christian fantasies of uniting the whole world, one church, one government. We have this idea now that we're going to break down all the borders, and this beautiful globalist utopia. The United Nations is supposed to be kind of a preface to that, and the EU, right, and all the rhetoric and all the moral rhetoric that comes out of like Britain trying to leave the EU. Well, but we're in this together, and that you're going to destroy this grand world order. A lot of people right now are coming back to Machiavelli's way of looking at things and saying, actually there are specific circumstances that are unique to a group of people in a place and a time, and the ways of living and the traditions that develop in that place and time are not going to work everywhere. And you can't actually universalize things because circumstances are specific. That's, people talk about Trumpist kind of nationalism and Trumpist exclusionary, this kind of, internal turning inward. I'm recording this before the election, by the way. So when you hear this, Trump may or may not have been reelected. But either way, right, this idea that that's just the sort of xenophobic turning inward is not the point at all. It's to say, look, America is a specific thing. It's not just a set of ideas, even though we have very important ideas that govern us. We are a people who have lived in this place for a certain amount of time. We have a history, and you can't just swan in, and not accept our way of life, not accept our ideals. That impulse is also kind of a Machiavellian impulse, that like the specifics of a time and place are important for how that place is best governed. And that brings me to my next kind of important point about him, which is that he is not a monarchist, right? And when because The Prince is such a famous work, you sort of think of him as this, supporter of tyranny, supporter of dictators, and supporter of kind of iron-fisted control. He does advocate very, very harsh measures sometimes in order for a prince who is taking control to keep control. And that's part of that stability, is part of the kind of forceful, manly leadership that he believes in. But that's not to imply that he thinks that there should only be principalities in the world. In fact, he seems to think that actually the most virtuous thing is a republic. And I'm going to read again from the discourses on Livy here to kind of tell you a little bit about it. And then I'll read also some commentary on it that I think is very, very helpful. But so in book 1, chapter 10 of the discourses on Livy, he says, "Of all men that are praised, those are praised most who have played the chief part in founding a religion. Next come those who have founded either republics or kingdoms. After them, in the order of celebratees, are ranked army commanders who have added to the extent of their own dominions or to that of their countries, with whom may be conjoined men of letters of many different kinds, who are each celebrated according to their status. Some modicum of praise is also ascribed to any man who excels in some art and in the practice of it, and of these the number is legion. On the other hand, those are held to be infamous and detestable, who extirpate religion, subvert kingdoms and republics, make war on virtue, on letters, and on any art that brings advantage and honor to the human race, i.e. the profane, the violent, the ignorant, the worthless, the idle, the coward. Nor will there ever be anyone, be he foolish or wise, wicked or good, who, if called upon to choose between these two classes of men, will not praise the one that calls for praise and blame the one that calls for blame." So he's not amoral. He does have a very specific system of values. And that system of values does not advocate monarchy in every case, nor, in fact, does it advocate ruthlessness in every case. In some cases, it advocates great generosity, especially to your kind of allies and friends, because that will help you, again, to maintain this stability. Note the emphasis, right, on the sort of fools and mountebanks who attack the stability of the state. Let me read now from the introduction to this edition, which is by Bernard Crick. And he writes a wonderful introduction. It's from 1970. And it tells a little bit more about this set of ideas. He says, now, Crick writes, "Now, the greatest feat of pure political virtuosity known to Machiavelli, and first described in The Prince, is to turn a flourishing republic into a principality. But the most damnable, The greatest praise is to be reserved for an almost equally difficult feat described in the discourses, the prince, hero, or legislator who deliberately creates a new republic out of unlikely or ambiguous human material. But there is no doubt that Machiavelli thinks it more difficult to destroy a republic than to create one, which is why a prince may have to be so utterly ruthless. So he's saying that these two books are basically two sides of a coin. That one is about creating principalities and gaining power. That's the prince. And one is about maintaining republics, which are these very, very fragile things. And he basically thinks that if the circumstances aren't there for making a republic, you just might have to bite the bullet and give it up. And that, in some cases, it's simply not possible to maintain a republic. And we'll talk more about what the circumstances are under which you want to, that might be auspicious for making a republic. But let's note also kind of the comments that he makes. This is chapter 5 of The Prince, about destroying or mastering a city accustomed to freedom. Machiavelli says, he who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it. For in rebellion, it has always the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privileges unless they are made disunited or dispersed, but at every chance they rally to them, as Pisa after the 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. Remember that the government under which Machiavelli served and had his, stint in public life was the interim period between the two Medici rules. So Machiavelli again lives in Florence. Florence has a strong tradition of Republican leadership. What he does not think is that the only good or righteous state is the state run by this kind of, as it were, Machiavellian, ruthless leader. However, there are a few circumstances under which republics can be held and maintained. And one of them is that tradition of liberty, right? The traditions need to be amenable to that. And you need to have a sort of strong tradition of civic virtue, of this sense that people are going to rally behind liberty, almost to the death. You have to teach that over time. It doesn't come naturally to people. And so what Machiavelli is basically saying is, if that's not the case, and if what you have is a place that, either has already been brought under subjugation or simply, is looking for a ruler, or else there will be chaos, then here's how the prince ought to do it. If you live in that world, as we sometimes do, here's how it's got to go. And this is, interestingly, this actually lies behind a lot of the reasoning of our founding fathers, who, of course, are big Republicans and founded a republic, but who also have this sense of realism that Machiavelli kind of inaugurates. Here's a passage from Federalist 51, famous passage from the Federalist Papers. Remember, these are papers in defense of the American Constitution. 1788, Federalist 51, James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So now that last part, that kind of high principle, is something with which I think Machiavelli, whether or not he would agree, I think he would be a little bit more jaundiced about whether that sort of thing is always possible. And so certainly I think our founding fathers were more idealist than Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, in some cases, as I've sort of been hinting, is sort of averse, I think, to theory, averse to kind of broad sweeping statements that have no exception. He's too much of a careful reader of Aristotle, who, as we said, is also very into detail. He's too close and careful in his reading of Aristotle's Politics to do that. But this thing about if men were angels, there would be no government, but they're not, right? That is central also to our ideas about capitalism in this country, our ideas, well, of course, there are plenty of systems you could make up if everybody were, friends and if everybody were perfect. But so many kind of utopian fantasies are based on that, and that's why they fail, because men are actually terribly fallen. And you can compare this with chapter 15 of The Prince, in which he talks more about the distinctiveness of his method. So this is where we get, remember in the opening to the discourses, he said, I am charting totally new territory. Well, here's more on that. Here's chapter 15. Many have written about this, that is, about the methods and measures a prince should employ with his subjects and friends, and I fear I might be considered presumptuous, particularly as I intend to depart from the principles laid down by others. As my intention is to write something useful for discerning minds, I find it more fitting to seek the truth of the matter rather than imaginary conceptions. Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or heard of. Think, if you will, both about that sort of Christian utopia of world government, but also, of course, about Plato's Republic, which is an imaginary perfect government. But he's saying that sort of hyper-theoretical, perfected governmental theory is too abstract, and because it never comes into being. And he says, because how one lives and how one ought to live are so far apart that he who spurns what is actually done for what ought to be done will achieve ruin rather than his own preservation. A man who strives to make a show of correct comportment in every circumstance can only come to ruin among so many who have other designs. Hence, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how to be able not to be good and to use or not to use this ability according to circumstances. So, it's more complicated than the ends justify the means. That's kind of the, the bumper sticker version of that people take out of Machiavelli. But what it really is that there are certain things without which there can be no continuity or stability. And one of those things is stable government. And that he puts a very high price on that because he's seen himself what happens when you don't have it. He was a victim of torture, right? Because of this, because of the kind of intrigue and back and forth of switching from government to government. And so he knows just how much it sucks when you don't have, stable rule of law. So that's, a big part of his project. And of course, the other thing is just this intense insistence on unflinching realism, you might call it. And again, that's not immorality. It's something that kind of comes up even, we associate this as we think of this as kind of anti-Christian and Machiavelli is very, let's say, sort of cynical about religion and thinks of it as kind of what's the use of religion? He wants to think of it as like a tool, a means to an end. But we, in Christianity, we do also have similar ideas because Christians have been persecuted so often throughout history, right? You have Matthew 10:16, be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. This idea that you're out in this rough and tumble world. And Machiavelli, in a very famous passage, says that a prince had better know how to switch between the strategies of the lion and the fox. You have to be forceful like the lion, but you have to be dastardly and cunning and sort of sneaky like the fox. And you have to know when to switch between the two. And this is in the name of something. It's in the name of acquiring governmental stability. It's in the name of, developing power of state that has some kind of continuity. Now, there are two very famous passages that we will, by the way, of course, we will come back to this text. I mean, there's so much that we could say about it, and there are so many famous passages, but there are two very famous passages that I will read just so that we can sort of see some of what we've said in action. The first passage, very, very famous, of new principalities acquired through arms and skill. So it's about getting control of a state with your arms and your skill. Arms being weaponry, of course, not just your actual guns, not your muscles. Okay, so here's this passage I'm talking about. It is necessary when examining this matter to ascertain whether the prince introducing the new order can act alone or must depend on others. In other words, he must seek help or use force to achieve his innovations. If he seeks help, he will always end up badly and accomplish nothing. But if he relies on his own skill and can use force, the innovator will rarely be in harm's way. Machiavelli often sort of offers these bifurcated decision trees. Well, either you do this or you do that, and then you have to do this because this is a bad choice. You go here, and then you have two more choices. So this is why all armed prophets were successful, while unarmed prophets came to ruin. Very famous line. And another factor that must be considered is that a populace is always erratic. It is easy enough to win the people over, but difficult to keep their allegiance. Therefore, matters must be arranged in such a way that when the populace no longer believes, a prince can compel them to believe by force. You see what I mean about this cynicism about religion, right? Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus, these ancient figures from kind of the classical past and also the biblical past, right, would not have been able to make their people observe their laws for long without the force of arms, as we have seen in our own times with Girolamo Savonarola. So remember, I talked about Savonarola was not an armed prophet. He was a prophet that came to ruin, hanged, his body burned. He came to ruin with his new order when the multitude lost belief in him. Savonarola did not have a system for holding on to those who had believed in him, nor did he have a system for making those believe who did not. Therefore, rulers like Savonarola have great difficulty in proceeding. Their path is strewn with difficulties that they must overcome through prowess. Once they overcome these difficulties, the populace begins to venerate them. And once these rulers have eliminated those who resent their achievement, they remain powerful, secure, honored, and content. Now, this, as I said, is a very famous passage. It leads us into talking about something very important in Machiavelli, which we have not yet talked about, and that is virtu, the Italian word meaning, or translated often as virtue, but it's somewhat deceptive to translate it as virtue for a reason that is very telling about Machiavelli. Now, we've talked about virtue before when we talked about Aristotle. We talked about the Greek word arete, which just means excellence. And we noted that there's excellence of running, right? There's excellence of cooking. There are all sorts of excellences that aren't moral excellences. And the moral excellences are the ones that we start talking about when we talk about ethics. So being very, very good at being a human in flourishing includes things like being good at liberality, hitting the mean between cowardice and over-brashness, right, which is called courage. All of these things are the ethical virtues. But there are other virtues. Just being good at anything is an arete. Now, Machiavelli is drawing from the Latin word, which is the equivalent of arete, virtus. And virtus comes from vir, which is man, and is where we get our word virile. So there's a very distinct sense of manliness in the Roman idea of virtue, which, of course, is not limited to men. Women were known to have virtue in even in Rome. And there are plenty of arguments that plenty of arguments in antiquity that even though this word is derived from man, it's not limited to men. However, whereas the Greek word for manliness, Andrea, is specifically one virtue, courage. In Latin, virtus is manhood, manliness, and it comes into our language as virtue, but also as virility and things like that. So when he's talking about virtu, he's talking about an excellence that is not only moral. And this is something that, people talk about the Machiavellian concept of virtu all the time. I think a really good way of looking at it is that it's not amoral. It doesn't have nothing to do with morality, but it is much like some of the qualities of manhood, like courage. It can be directed in moral and in immoral ways. And so when I say it's not amoral, I mean that it always has moral characteristics, but they can be good or bad. And it's not specifically a purely ethical virtue. So when you say virtue now, you think of ethical virtues. You think of generosity and kindness and forgiveness and all this stuff. But virtu, although it includes certain forms of ethical virtue, is more than that, is this kind of boldness and daring and things that you cannot do good without virtu, because you'll be crushed by the world if you don't have this kind of manly striding forth. And this is the armed prophets have this kind of forcefulness about them. So you can't do good or evil, really, without virtue. It's the capacity to act. And that's because it comes from a sort of deeper sense of excellence than just the ethical virtues, which are, as we said, only a subset of the various possible virtues. Virtue is somewhat bigger and can be directed in, morally just and virtuous or morally unjust ways, and yet is still praiseworthy. This is something that we have a hard time grasping, right? You can praise things that are immoral, but nevertheless admirable. You can show courage in an evil act. And even though we condemn the evil of the act, we still recognize, wow, that is courage, and there's something, Breaking Bad is the classic example. And actually all the stuff that I talked about, when we talked about the Maltese Falcon and the American bad boy, right? And people pointed out it's kind of the lawless good, but even, with anti-heroes where sometimes people are doing stuff we really don't condone, we still look at Walter White, the hero of Breaking Bad, and think, wow, he really found his cojones. He really went out there and kind of rose up over his weakness and did something. And that's why, we like him, even though we also feel like, he's kind of a in the end, he's done this ultimately terrible thing, and there's been terrible bloodshed and so forth. And it's too simple to say, well, because he was evil, we just condemn him and we don't, we deny the fact. Our liking him is kind of just based on our own evil. It's too simple. It has to do with the bigger meaning of virtue, which again, you need virtue. You need virtue in the big sense, excellence, to be able to do anything big, whether it be good or bad. But you also, there's more to virtue than just being a nice guy. And there's more to excellence, unfortunately, than moral excellence. There are other kinds of arete. Now, this isn't to say that the moral virtues are sort of unimportant or that you can dispense with them. In my opinion, of course, they're central to what it is to be a human being. But Machiavelli is, again, being a realist about the necessity of virtue simply in its pure kind of jet fuel form. And then, he has comments about where it's just and unjust to direct your virtue. But virtue in and of itself, I think, has this kind of bigger sense that doesn't necessitate acting in a just or an ethical way. That's something to understand about Machiavelli, to get beyond the perception of him as just, shrugging off ethics. It's not that he doesn't care about ethics. It's that he recognizes virtue, which goes beyond ethics, or which at least has, qualities that can be directed in good or bad ways. And all men know this, that you can channel your manly energies in creative and constructive ways and kind of, work to build things. Or you can, if you're untutored, or if you're kind of, somewhat degenerate, you can channel them in these terrible ways and in destructive ways. So that's one passage that I wanted to sort of highlight and talk about. Here's another very famous one, which gets a little more at virtue, and this will be the last one that we read for now until we return again. It's chapter 25 on Fortuna. Very, very, again, famous chapter. He says, I am not unaware that many believe that the things of this world are governed to such an extent by fortune and God that men, with all their foresight, cannot change them, that in fact there is no improving them. Those who believe this deem that they need not toil and sweat, but can let themselves be governed by fortune. So he's talking about the quiescence of not believing in free will, basically. That if you believe everything is just fate, then you can sort of let fate carry you along. He says, this opinion has been more prevalent in our time because of the great upheavals that we have witnessed and witness every day. We've talked now a lot about what those upheavals were, and which are beyond anything we could have foreseen, right? He knows best of all that you can't predict kind of what's going to happen. He's seen governments come and go. He says, and there have been times when even I have to some extent inclined to this opinion. Nevertheless, fortune seems to be the arbiter of half our actions, but she does leave us the other half, or almost the other half, in order that our free will may prevail. I would compare fortune to one of those violent torrents that flood the plains, destroying trees and buildings, hurling earth from one place to another. Everyone flees this torrent. Everyone yields to its force without being able to stand up to it. As this is the torrent's nature, man should not neglect to prepare himself with dikes and dams in times of calm, so that when the torrent rises, it will gush into a channel, its force neither harmful nor so unbridled. Now, this, again, is an example of why you need virtue that goes beyond morality, in the sense of, what you do, your individual actions when you're a strong statesman may be harsh, they may be punitive, or they may be kind and generous, because you have a bigger aim in mind. And that aim, again, is stability. It's kind of like, in a family, your dad sometimes is, great to hang out with. And then sometimes, your parents have to do the hard work of punishing you for stuff that you've done wrong. And that is not to say that Machiavelli thinks princes are always acting in the best interests of the people. But it is to say that this sense of strong action, which is the essence, I think, of virtue, and not just of kind of perceptiveness about what the best thing is to do and when to zig and when to zag, but also just the fortitude, the thumos, to use the Greek word that we've talked about before, the kind of energy, the manly energy to do stuff, is the sine qua non, the thing that you can't fight fortune without. And that gives rise to this very famous analogy. He says, therefore, at the end of the chapter, I conclude that when fortune changes and men rigidly continue their ways, they will flourish so long as fortune and their ways are in accord, but they will come to ruin the moment these are in discord. In my view, however, it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortuna, is a woman, and if you wish to dominate her, you must beat and batter her. It is clear that she will let herself be won by men who are impetuous rather than by those who will step cautiously. Therefore, like a woman, she is more partial to young men because they are less cautious, wilder, and command her with greater audacity. Now, none of this is to endorse beating and battering women. I want to be very clear about that. However, Machiavelli is saying something crucial about the way that virtue and assertiveness act in the world, that virtue is more than being nice, that their virtue is more than ethics, and that sometimes the thing that is most needful is a daring and bold, assertive person to counter this world that Machiavelli insists on, the real world that we live in, which is this terribly uncertain world full of storms that buffet you and all kinds of mishaps that you could never possibly predict. He's saying, in that world, you got to be tough, man. And it's not actually, I mean, he's very blunt sometimes about some of the, again, having been the object of torture, he's blunt about the need for torture, the use of torture in states. He pulls no punches. But ultimately, you have to understand him as this very sophisticated humanist in a much more. He's always one step ahead of you in that he's actually doing something visionary that would shape the realm of political philosophy from then on. And all of our ideas about realpolitik, it's sometimes called, of just, I must do this thing because if not, this other terrible thing will happen. All these problems that we constantly ponder over, well, if you can torture somebody and get the name of, if you can kill one person and get the name of this other person that's going to destroy an entire city, would you do it? Those kinds of questions and things that we ponder are Machiavelli's questions, and our admiration for people that can be brutally honest about stuff also, I think, comes from Machiavelli. That is almost the end of what I have to say about Machiavelli, but I want to consider briefly where we stand in this whole republic principality question. I mentioned that Machiavelli thinks you can only be a republic if you have the right circumstances. What are those circumstances? Well, as I said, one of them is, at least, this idea, this training and tradition of civic virtue. And when I say virtue now, you know a little bit more what I mean, right? Civic virtu. And you can read our founding fathers on the necessity for, personal ownership over the military defense of the American ideal. Something that we are sorely lacking. When people say, oh, my freedoms are being stepped upon, it's like, yeah, the founders knew that, and they expected you to step up. And this is virtu. It's not pretty. It's not always nice, but it's something that you have to be ready to do. This whole thing about civil disobedience in this country, right? Like, if you are being told to shut your church down because of a virus with a 99+% survival rate, right? It's your job to go to church and say, arrest me if you want. I mean, I was looking at footage from New York the other day with cops banging on the door of these Orthodox Jewish worshipers, right? And there's 10 people in the house, and they're, therefore you can't have. I mean, that's truly dystopian stuff, right? Listen to what John Adams writes in a letter. This is a letter from 1783 to the Abbé de Mably. And he says there are 4 things that you have to have, 4 institutions that were essential to achieving American liberty and that are essential to maintaining it. The churches, the towns, the schools, and the militia. He goes on to talk about them. And here's what he says about the militia. He says, the militia comprehends the whole people. By the law of the land, every male inhabitant between 16 and 60 years of age is enrolled in a company and a regiment of militia, completely organized with all its officers, is obliged to keep at his own expense constantly in his house a firelock in good order, a powder horn with a pound of powder, 12 flints, 24 bullets, a cartouche box, and a haversack, so that the whole country is ready to march to their defense at a short warning. The companies and regiments are obliged to assemble certain times of the year at the command of their officers for the view of their arms and ammunition to go through the military exercises. Whoa. Imagine if every American city lived and worked like that, right? And so the question on my mind is, do we have the circumstances that are in which a republic can flourish, right? I mean, being as brutally honest as, Machiavelli would want me to be, I have to ask, are we really ready to defend ourselves against the kind of oppressive state power that we have seen over these last several months? I hope so. And somebody asked recently, do we have the kind of groundswell movement? Because it's all very well and good for me to sit here and talk about it, but is it really going to happen? Do we have the stones? Do we have the virtu? I really, really hope so. And I think that one thing we can do is just insist upon it in ourselves, right? That cringe that you have where somebody's looking at me funny because I'm doing the thing that like nobody else, I'm standing up doing the thing nobody else is doing. I'm going to get looked at funny in my class because I'm a conservative and, I say conservative things, right? Whatever it is, that if you can't withstand that cringe, you're not going to withstand the greater challenges of virtu and of the world that we still live in. Even, ever since Machiavelli, we still live in that world where like things are gonna go down. You've got to be ready, man. So I bring up Machiavelli in part for this reason, because I think that, he gets this bad rap of being ruthless because we live in a world that hates realism, that hates just sort of blunt honesty about what the times are and what you got to do to defend your own. But sometimes, as they say, you got to do what you got to do. I hope this has profited you, this reading of Machiavelli. Let's briefly do the mailbag. Mailbag questions, as I say, come to me from Twitter. So if you want to ask one, go on Twitter, tweet at me, at Spencer Klavan, and you can put in the hashtag Young Heretics so then I can find it. All right. I really like this question. This is from Chad John Wallace, at Chad John Wallace on Twitter. Has it just always been the case that there are a significant degree of things happening in the world to be displeased about from a Christian perspective? Or is modernity significantly worse in that respect than before it? Chad and I have a back and forth on Twitter, so sometimes we have talked about this. I believe that the answer to this question is the church. The default setting for the Christian church is persecution and suffering. And that's a hard Machiavellian pill to swallow if ever there was. That's tough truth. But even as we speak, even as I am, certainly free to practice my religion, at least, if I dare to go to church, which I do. But around the world, there are people being hunted down by the state in North Korea, for example, that have to hide. So our sense that it's a good time to be a Christian is a pretty European, Anglo-American centric idea, right? There are people all over the world under threat in the Middle East of being beheaded for praying the Our Father. So in the world, as Jesus says, you will have trouble. It's true. The kind of trouble that you have and the degree that you personally in your life have is up to God. And I do think that different people have lived very comfortable lives as good Christians. And some people, just don't live in rough times. It is not for us to calculate whether we are, well off or poorly off. We have one job, and that is to serve God in his Son, Jesus Christ. And there's really, making calculations about whether things are better or worse than they were 5-10 years ago is historically interesting. But ultimately, C.S. Lewis says these are the kinds of questions that heaven does not answer. And so I sort of suspect that we will get back and look back on all of this in the end. And there will be many surprises for us about just, because you only told your own story, right? You only know what it's like to be you. Ultimately, you can hear from other people who have obviously suffered worse and terrible persecution, but you don't know what role you play in the vast thing, which is the body of Christ. I hope that gives some courage. It's like, keep your eye on the prize, man. Just there's really only one thing you have to do. And it's going to take a different form in each time and place. This is practical wisdom. I've talked about that a lot on this episode and before, this idea that you have your principles, but then you have how you apply them in the day, in the moment. And you got to trust God that he will guide you into what that is in any given time. Right now, I think one big thing is go to church. Go to church. Defy those who tell you not to. It's that they cannot under American law, but more importantly, they cannot in the eyes of God. So that's one thing, I don't know how to weigh that against some other thing that happened some other time, except to say that some things are obviously, North Koreans obviously have it much worse than us. And somebody always got it way worse than you. That's the other thing. But your job is the same. You've got one job. So do it. Okay, God bless, and I will see you again next week. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out the Claremont Review books and The American Mind, two excellent publications about the American ideals. And you can find us at ClaremontReviewBooks.com and AmericanMind.org, or donate at Claremont.org/donate. Let them know you heard about us through Young Heretics. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.